Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. I'm joined by Senior Managing Editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
We invite you, our listeners, to show your support for Mormon Land by going to patreon.com, where, for as little as $3 a month, you can access all of the Tribune's religion coverage, including special General Conference stories, transcripts of our podcasts, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. Now for today's episode. When a spokesperson for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints offered a stinging rebuke of Tim Ballard, the charismatic founder of Operation Underground Railroad, an anti-human-trafficking organization and a fellow Latter-day Saint, his defenders went ballistic. They were especially incensed when the statement said M. Russell Ballard, acting president of the faith's Quorum of the 12 Apostles, disavowed Tim Ballard, who is no relation, and condemned the activist for using the senior apostle's name in his fundraising. It couldn't have come from the church they love, these Tim Ballard devotees reasoned. They had to believe it was some kind of fake news, or worse, a deep conspiracy. Latter-day Saint historian Benjamin Park, though, had no trouble believing the church's condemnation of OUR's founder. He sees in Tim Ballard's impressive following a link to many other far-right causes and conspiracy theories, and even possible schism. Park joins us today via Zoom to explain the larger issues he has observed with Tim Ballard's movement and the implications of extreme conservative politics for the church. Professor Park, welcome.
Thank you. It's glad to be here.
What did you think when you first read the church's statement about Tim Ballard?
I was shocked. I wasn't shocked that Tim Ballard had gotten caught up in some things, because there had been many people raising red flags about Ballard's operations and writings and exaggerated claims for years. But it is rare for the LDS Church to deliver such a stinging rebuke to an individual member. Even when you think back to those who have had public excommunications, statements from church leaders are very sparse. And they'll say something like, this is left up to local leaders, or reaffirming the right for a church to excommunicate, but rarely actually stating something about a person's character. So when I saw that, first of all, I was amazed that the church would do this. But second of all, I knew that this was going to cause some major ripples, because Tim Ballard had gained such a stature, not just in Mormon, but in American popularity, that this was going to cause quite a serious crisis for a number of people who pledge allegiance both to the LDS Church and to Tim Ballard's operations.
Yeah, you alluded to this, but can you cite some other examples of when the church has made such critical public statements about an individual member?
I was racking my brain about this and going back to previous public statements, whether it be on the September 6th, which we just commemorated the 30th anniversary. So going back to the church's statements back then, or whether it be on more recent occasions with John DeLynn or Kate Kelly or Natasha Helfer, that in all of those cases, they did not get into specifics about their character or their personality. And they came nowhere close to giving a statement like that this person did things that were morally indefensible. So I think that just reflects the nature of this particular issue, and that one, it presses a number of key issues for the church due to reasons that I'm sure we'll get into, but also due to the public nature of Tim Ballard and him using the church's name for a variety of purposes. It's just kind of a symphony of different tensions coming together into that one statement, which I'm sure was parsed by dozens of people and lots of lawyers and receiving lots of attention, which is, of course, what made made me laugh whenever there's all the accusations. Well, surely this wasn't the church that actually did it, or surely this is a rogue spokesperson. I mean, if you know the grand bureaucracy that goes behind each and every statement of the LDS Church, you knew that a lot of thought and approval went into that.
So, Ben, I'm trying to rack my brain and think even of an outside critic of the church, or some dissident or something. Like, did you say James Huntsman, who was suing the church?
Yeah.
I can't think of anything that had this kind of verbiage, this kind of language, right?
No, nor could I. In most cases, the church is defending itself rather than going on the offensive against specific people. Looking back on the September 6th excommunications and disciplines, for example, the only statements that the church would give out is that we reserve the right to discipline members when they do things that go against our guidelines, and that these decisions are made at local levels, yada, yada, yada. Or when it was on John DeLynn, they talk about that we believe that there are individual reasons that go into this. There are institutional priorities that we must maintain, but they certainly didn't use the language like morally indefensible. So I think this is truly unprecedented in some ways of how they frame it.
Even Michael Resendez, when he wrote about the Arizona abuse case, if you remember, I mean, the church was issued several statements that got increasingly stronger against the journalism or the piece,
Yep.
but not against the person, certainly,
right?
Or even really against the news agency, except to say that they blew it in their
right,
minds.
Exactly. Which to me seems to imply that the church did not take this lightly, and that prompted by the investigation by the Vice reporters and others, and Lynn Packer, who have been looking into this, it probably prompted the LDS Church to do a bit of their own background research. And what they found prompted this. This was not a knee-jerk reaction for comment. This was, I'm sure, the product of a lot of deliberation, and the veracity of that statement probably hints to what they discovered.
And you've already alluded to this, but you were familiar, of course, somewhat with Tim Ballard before and Operation Underground Railroad. What was your thinking about the organization and Tim Ballard before this statement came out?
Yeah, I should say that most historians know Tim Ballard for his works of history. And I use history with scare quotation marks around those words and a lot of italics. And I'm sure we might get into this later, because we know that he's not someone who's very trustworthy on whether it be analytical skills, self-promotion, or argumentative approach. I used to, a number of years ago, I used to hold out hope that while he was a horrible historian, maybe he's a good, activist for various causes, because who doesn't want to support ending sex trafficking of women and children? I mean, that's a cause that would have 100% universal approval in respectable society. But there have been a lot of people who first at whispers and then full-blown articles talking about the deficiencies of Ballard's actions, his activities, that on the one hand, it seemed clear that he was exaggerating what he was doing. It also seemed clear that there was a megalomaniac aspect of how Tim Ballard was doing these things to kind of promote his own persona rather than ending, broader problems. And then you start seeing some of the political affiliations that cause the whole franchise into doubt, where the way they frame their operations and the way they talk about the broader global evil and these cabals that they're taking on fit a particular ideological and partisan framework for the world, whether it be QAnon adjacent, referring to the conspiracy theory that there's this, global cabal who are living on the blood of innocent children. But even when Tim Ballard comes out and supports Donald Trump's border wall issue, despite all the experts coming out that such initiatives are going to increase sex trafficking and cause problems for social oppression, that he still is not only approving, but endorsing those types of measures, show that it was more of an ideological project than an actual practical one. And so I think a lot of people were raising their trumpets to call out the problems with Ballard's Operation Underground Railroad, even before we got some of the particular issues that came out of, both internal and external investigations over the last few years.
So the response from some of Ballard's supporters was somewhat startling to me, I guess, as an observer. These are all reportedly active Latter-day Saints, some of whom were saying, taking after President Ballard, saying, well, I sustain him as a profiteer and rebel. I despise him. I mean, it caused people to say, well, if I had to choose between Tim Ballard and Russell Ballard, I choose Tim Ballard. I mean, did that surprise you?
The degree to which, it's always surprising because you want to expect better. You want to assume that people aren't reading religion through a political lens. But the reality is that we have decades of cultural development that have led to this point. And so the signs have been marked all along, whether we want to see them or not. Mormonism's modern affiliation with the religious right has been a project that has been deeply entrenched in Latter-day Saints society for 5 decades now, to the point to where you have members of the church who are often conflicted of whether they're going to trust their far right wing leaders or their ecclesiastical authorities. Another sign of this that people were similarly surprised, myself included, was during the pandemic when so many church members rebelled against church leaders who said you need to get vaccinated or wear a mask, because that, went against what they were hearing on Fox News. And so I think when you have these cultural convergences like we see with Mormonism and the religious right, the boundaries between those authorities become quite blurry, to the point to where now M. Russell Ballard can just tweet something out about following the Savior, and his replies are flooded with Latter-day Saints saying you need to repent for questioning our apostle of this other cultural movement that they now take out for higher ground.
So, Ben, in your recent Slate article about this episode, you say that the dispute between Tim Ballard and the church is, quote, yet another example of conservative angst within an evolving church. What did you mean by that?
I meant that we've had several episodes and tensions and movements over the last couple of decades that reflect this very dynamic that I'd outlined, that you have these blurred spheres between far-right culture and Mormonism. And when Latter-day Saint leaders no longer, or in certain aspects, don't walk lockstep with these far-right movements or anxieties, there's a conflict. Now, you can see this in a number of different examples. Most prominently, the Splinter group led by Denver Snuffer, the Mormon schismatic leader who really buys into a declension narrative of the Latter-day Saint Church kind of falling into disrepair. Joseph Smith was a pure, pristine prophet, and it's all been downhill since. And what Denver Snuffer and others offer is kind of a reenchantment that God once again speaking. In many ways, this is Mormonism reincarnated just for another generation. But if you read closely, you also see a lot of markers in the Denver Snuffer movement that latch on to this broader conservative world, a distrust of modern day secularism, a frustration with institutions becoming too bureaucratized, and a movement more for a quasi-libertarian trajectory. You also see a number of people who are using similar declension narratives. And by declension narrative, I mean like things are just getting worse, right? Where we had pristine Mormonism in the past, and we need to return to that. Whether it be people who are denouncing the church's historical department for publishing things on Joseph Smith practicing polygamy, or the new confounding conspiracy that Joseph Smith was killed by the Quorum of the 12 Apostles rather than a Carthage mob. And then, of course, the things that happened during the pandemic that I mentioned concerning vaccination and masks. I don't think it's a coincidence that this is happening at the same time that you see a far-right alliance of viewing political partisan figures as religious messiahs. I mean, just this week, we saw a new poll that came out that said nearly double the amount of Republicans in America believe Donald Trump to be a person of faith than Republicans who believe Mitt Romney is a person of faith. That will shock lots of people, but it makes sense when you understand that American religion, not just Mormonism, but American religions, white Christians especially, more broadly, have come to see partisan affiliation as a signifier of religious identity rather than theological principles or personal piety.
I want to delve into that a little bit more, Ben. We saw these fractures between members on the far right in the church hierarchy, like you referred to during the COVID-19 battles over vaccinations. But we also saw it even more directly in a political question of how the church responded to the 2020 election, when it ultimately waited a while, congratulated Joe Biden on his victory and urging members to accept the results. Do you see the church's recent warning in that updated neutrality statement against straight ticket voting as an attempt to rein in those members?
Very gently. But yes, it's similar to Dallin H. Oaks at the General Conference after the January 6th insurrection, talking about the necessity of, taking political loss in stride and the importance of preserving constitutional order. I think you see church leaders concerned about even if they're not committed to directly addressing it. We've seen that, say whatever else you want about LDS leaders. They're typically smooth political operators, and they know which way the tide is moving, and they don't want to do things that's going to alienate a majority of their members. And they are reading the same polls that we have. In fact, they probably have far more data than we do on personal beliefs of Latter-day Saints. And they recognize this growing right-wing conservative angst. And so I see some general course corrections, but I also see them rarely wanting to directly set foot on it, which is what made their statement on Ballard all the more alarming. And all the more evidence that what they discovered about Ballard was more than many might assume.
You've spoken to this a little bit, but is there something the church could do more directly to keep its right-wing members from spiraling out?
I think there has to be a specific and consistent address on it. Not just someone who's giving some remarks, speaking on behalf of the church at some, University of Utah function, right? Or not just one person who's speaking at BYU in a devotional address. It has to be a theme through one or two conferences that specifically addresses the issues at hand. Because when you're talking about we need to, I don't know why I slid in my Dallin H. Oaks voice there, but we need to follow the Constitution. That's a phrase that conservative members of the faith are going to mean, oh, that's obviously directed at liberals thing. That's not directed at us. And I don't think it's rare or unheard of for the church to get specific on issues. How frequently do they denounce LGBTQ legislation or issues like that? I think that the fact that the church is often more specific when denouncing quote unquote progressive causes and more general when denouncing conservative problems is one of the factors that led to the present moment.
You just alluded to that Dallin Oaks speech at General Conference about the Constitution, which liberals read. I mean, he's definitely talked about accepting the results of elections and that the U.S., the passage, the peaceful transfer of power made liberals think, see, he's talking about, he's chastising conservatives, but conservatives didn't read it that way or hear it that way. Like you say, they heard he loves the Constitution just like we do.
Right. Because they're not used to being specifically challenged, right? There's been this long tradition of directly challenging progressive causes and maybe moderately but indirectly addressing the conservative thing. So they're not patterned to see that. And so I think that's, an issue going forward that the church might have to address. And further, I think one reason why the church is hesitant to do so is because to honestly address this issue would mean admitting some complicity in causing the problem, right? I think of, for a counterexample, Mitt Romney, who in his number of speeches over the last few years, and especially in the interviews and documents that he provided to McKay Coppins for the biography that's coming out in a month, he's pretty upfront in saying that, look, I was part of the problem. I now recognize that I gave into these wishes that I have come to regret. And I think until we see that type of perspective from Latter-day Saint leaders, the root cause of these issues is continue to elide our ability to solve it.
So speaking of Mitt Romney, some of Tim Ballard's supporters think that the Vice article and the church statement was all timed to thwart Tim Ballard's efforts or his desire to fill Romney's seat. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so two thoughts. One is that the Vice investigation was years in the making, meaning that the Vice reporters have been working on this for several years. I remember being interviewed by them in the summer of 2021, where they already had certain materials. And it makes sense that you have an increase in their reporting this last year because they finally got access to the police investigation on Ballard. And they have said in other venues that they sent a request to comment to the church and waited 3 weeks. They didn't expect to hear back from the church, but 3 weeks later, they got the comment. So this was a long in-process step. However, and this is my second point, I think it would be wrong to assume that Ballard's Senate run did not play a role in the timing because the LDS Church was faced with this no right solution dilemma, where they are now in the possession of this data or details concerning Tim Ballard that they feel deserves a response. Mitt Romney announces he's retiring. It becomes well known that Tim Ballard might throw his hat in the ring. And the church is like, well, we can either put out our statement now and be accused of derailing his Senate campaign, or we can put out the statement after he announces and we'll be accused of directly intervening into an act of race. There's no right solution out of that. And so I think they came to choose the better of the two bad options.
As a historian, Ben, what do you think about, you've suggested these already, but what do you think about Tim Ballard's books of, quote, history, including works about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln that were published by Deseret Book?
As a historian of Mormonism, I've grown to become accustomed to bad history. Any religious denomination is going to have hagiographic works that try to sanctify past figures rather than critically investigate them. I mean, you can walk through the unnamed bookstore that proliferates in Utah, and you can find lots of books that I would have quite a few problems with. Tim Ballard's work are on another level. For those who are unfamiliar with the type of arguments that Tim Ballard makes, he has a trilogy of hypotheses, the George Washington hypothesis, or the Washington hypothesis, in which he argues that George Washington was visited by potentially the angel Moroni to be inspired during the American Revolution. You have the Lincoln hypothesis, in which he argues that Abraham Lincoln was inspired by the Book of Mormon to write the Emancipation Proclamation. And then you have the Pilgrim hypothesis, which argues that the Pilgrims were inspired by this covenant with God that looks remarkably like the Mormon covenant of salvation, that then set the foundation for American society. Now, there are core ideas in all of those books that you can find throughout much of American religious history, hagiography. I teach a course on religion in early America where we do several weeks on religion and the founding fathers, and we talk about how those founding fathers who have a variety of different individual beliefs. There's no unified, religious idea of the founding fathers. There's a variety of them, how those people have been sacralized in a variety of different ways to match how a different generation wants to view them. But Tim Ballard's are so stretched in how they use bad evidence to make even worse arguments. Like, for instance, the George Washington being visited by the angel Moroni. There's no account from George Washington's lifetime of him claiming to be visited by an angel. We don't even have accounts of him being a frequent person who would speak about prayer or visitations. What we do have is nearly 80 years later, some person kind of writing what appears to be a explicitly fictional account of George Washington being visited by an angel as an allegorical story of, God leading the American Revolution, that Tim Ballard then plucks out, claiming that it's an explicit, historical, accurate account of George Washington, says, no, that's not even enough, and then changes that angel to the angel Moroni to tie it into the broader Mormon covenant. Or you have Abraham Lincoln checking out the Book of Mormon. Did Abraham Lincoln check out the Book of Mormon? Probably not. Someone at the White House checked out the Book of Mormon, and because it's checked out by the White House, it's under the name of Abraham Lincoln. Huzzah, we found that Abraham Lincoln has read the Book of Mormon. Whereas, the sheer audacity, I should say, of these figures who have had more written on them than any other Americans, to now have someone come out and say all these other historians who've written tens of thousands of books have not only missed this factor, but are fundamentally wrong, kind of represents this sense of confidence that Tim Ballard has in his stories, as well as the sheer delusion of making those types of arguments. And to connect this to the broader story, Tim Ballard then uses those stories to enshrine his own image. I mean, the title page of his Lincoln hypothesis is "A Modern Day Abolitionist Looks at Abraham Lincoln." And so those identities are tied together. His fraudulent historical works are meant to buttress his OUR operations, and his OUR operations are meant to support his ideological programs that are found in his books.
And don't you see that as also tying into the themes you were talking about earlier, which is in a way tying Mormonism into this sort of Christian nationalism movement? It's yet another piece of that overall program, would you say?
Absolutely. And I think it's not a coincidence that Tim Ballard loves to affiliate with the Firm Foundation and these other groups that push what we call the Heartlander model of the Book of Mormon, which say that, all those Mormon apologists who are saying that the Book of Mormon took place in Central or South America, they're wrong because it was in America, part of the American covenant, part of this Mormon version of Christian nationalism. That's why Tim Ballard is able to succeed both within the Latter-day Saint sphere, where he can be explicit about these fringe ideas of the Book of Mormon leading to these important American moments, as well as converse in the broader white evangelical sphere, who are also aching for a form of re-sacralizing the American past and providing this covenant at the center of American identity.
But probably without the Book of Mormon angle, right?
With that part, in fact, there are stories of Tim Ballard's earliest books, giving this idea of the Mormon covenant and the American past, and then eventually rewriting them into books that kind of are shorn of the Mormon principles, but are addressed to the broader American public. I mean, that's why Glenn Beck and others can promote them, because it's not going to offend the white evangelicals. If you just cut out the Book of Mormon and the Angel Moroni parts and just start talking about the covenant issue of God having his hand in a particular vision of America, that's going to speak to a much larger audience and draw a lot more fundraising dollars.
So as we wrap up, Ben, I want to go to another question more inside the church itself. Polls show, even a fairly recent survey again, that younger Latter-day Saints are less likely to be wedded to, well, certainly the Republican Party and conservative politics. Will political balance eventually be brought to the church sort of naturally as they age into leadership roles? Or is there fear that they won't feel at home in the church and leave the faith overwhelmingly right-leaning members?
Yeah, it's a $1 million question. And on the one hand, I want to emphasize that the Mormon Republican alliance was never predetermined to get here, right? That was the result of decades of specific contexts and decisions and leaders. So that was, historians always reject the sense of predestination of getting to a certain point, which means that the future is also far from predetermined. And a Mormon Republican alliance would have been unthinkable a century ago. And so the fact that it got here shows that similarly unthinkable things today, Mormons and a Democratic alliance or whatnot, might be possible in the future, but certainly far from assured. The issue, though, is there seems to be a growing chasm between the principles that are at the heart of American progressivism and the LDS institution on certain matters, especially gender. As LGBTQ issues are increasingly becoming the bedrock of the Gen Z generation, and that the church remains clear on not embracing those principles, we might see that, yes, a majority of young Latter-day Saints affiliate with more progressive causes. But are they going to find a place within the Latter-day Saint institution, or are they going to go elsewhere for their belonging? That's going to be the question. For them to form a critical mass in the Latter-day Saint Church and remain within fellowship, I imagine, although historians make horrible prophets, I imagine that would take a number of concessions from the LDS institution on these matters. And frankly, I don't see that happening yet.
So
Do you see this playing out a little bit on a micro level at the BYUs right now?
BYU has always been the battleground for the broader tensions of American Mormonism. It's the place that the Latter-day Saint institution can still control. It's the place where they place a lot of attention. It's a place where you get agitation from both students and faculty. And as we've seen in recent years, the degree of individual freedom and personal expression on these issues has restricted at BYU. I think that's an unquestioned observation. And so I think that shows that the church probably wishes they could do that same type of control church-wide, but they can't. And so as a result, I think it's a signal for what the church hopes to do going forward.
So I have one last question, and I want to go back to the church's statement about Tim Ballard. And that is to remind or tell our listeners that for a long time, Tim Ballard's efforts were endorsed by many members of the church, including Deseret Book, published his books. And M. Russell Ballard himself did indeed have a friendship with Tim Ballard. I think people in the aftermath of the statement sort of forget that there actually was a fair amount of implicit endorsement of these ideas, which I guess makes sense given, in that statement, did you hear a real sense of betrayal by M. Russell Ballard in that statement? And how do you undo all those years of support?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a sense of betrayal in there that the church really, the church's statement was, we've never supported OUR. I'm sure a lot of lawyers debated over that word support, right? Because that support can mean a lot of things. And I imagine there's a lot of terminological qualifications where they're like, well, the church also gives a lot of money and promotes the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but that doesn't mean that they support the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Similarly, we've, said good things about Operation Underground Railroad, but we don't support them. But the fact is that you couldn't go into Deseret Book without seeing an entire bookcase devoted to the Hypothesis series. You couldn't go to Time Out for Women for a number of years without seeing Tim Ballard speak in the books for sale there. You couldn't go to the Operation Underground, the tour company that takes them and sees testimonials from, people who have gone on and talk about seeing M. Russell Ballard on it. So yeah, I think if anything, I think it's a metaphor or an analogy for the church and the far right in general, that there have been a long and to a large extent successful and happy union between the church and Tim Ballard, between the church and the far right. Both sides, all sides have benefited from it. All sides have been generally happy, which is what makes it all the more difficult when you have these moments of crisis, because then you might regret some of the alliances. You might worry about the causation that comes from them, but you're kind of stuck with it. It's the same thing that when we were talking about the pandemic and issues, that the church itself had cultivated this kind of anti-science, anti-mainstream knowledge discourse for decades. And then the only time when it became a problem was when their authority spun out of control as a result, and members are listening to, others instead of church officials. So I think with the Ballard case, with the right-wing American culture in general, there's a situation of sowing the wind and now reaping the whirlwind. That until you have that full reckoning, you're not going to be able to unwind.
Benjamin Park, whose new book, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, is due out in January. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. And congratulations on the 300th episode. I think the Mormon Land podcast has become a true staple of Mormon culture, and y'all are doing amazing work.
Thanks. And thanks to Dave Noyce and to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church and by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.